Well, let's get started. Let me go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. Bill Mazur is a 25-year law enforcement veteran and retired from the Atlantic City, New Jersey Police Department in 2017 at the rank of Deputy Chief. Bill holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Stockholm University and a master's degree in human resources training and development in the Police Graduate Studies program from Seton Hall University. He is also a graduate of the FBI National Academy, Session 256. Bill currently serves as a staff instructor with the FBI National Academy Associates in their Comprehensive Officer Resiliency Training Program and is a member of the FBI NAA Officer Safety and Wellness Committee. He is a former adjunct instructor for the Force Science Institute, which has been internationally recognized for the research regarding human factors in high stress, violent force encounters. Bill now works for Acadia Healthcare as a strategic account manager with the Treatment Placement Specialist Initiative, which provides specialized treatment guidance for public safety personnel, first responders, and their families who may find themselves in a personal crisis as a result of a mental health issue or substance use disorder. And Bill works with Joe, and Joe is my neighbor down here in Houston, so we're getting him texified. Joe Collins is a 35-year enforcement veteran who retired in 2020 from the Two Rivers, Wisconsin Police Department as a chief of police. Joe holds an associate's degree in police science, a bachelor's degree in administration of criminal justice, and a master's degree in managing organizational behavior. Joe is a graduate of the 236th session of the FBI National Academy and was the 2015-2016 president of the Wisconsin FBI National Academy Association, where he served 5 years on the executive board. He has previously served as co-chair of the FBI NAA Officer Safety and Wellness Committee and Training Committee for numerous years. Joe is a master instructor with the FBI NAA Comprehensive Officer Resilience Train the Trainer program and serves as a consultant for the U.S. Department of Justice as a subject matter expert in officer resilience. As a public safety liaison and a strategic account manager with Acadia's Healthcare Treatment Placement Specialist team, Joe provides specialized treatment guidance for public safety personnel, first responders, and families who may find themselves in a personal crisis. So thank you both for joining us today and doing this webinar training today that is so needed. And I'll turn it over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that warm intro and the kind invitation from Starlite to be here. And thank you, Darcel, for sharing that and providing context on your upbringing. We can identify with a bunch of the things that you just said. So look, we're super excited to be here. It looks like we have a pretty sizable audience, so that's always exciting as well. And we are just super pleased to be able to share this information with you. Our only qualifying statement is that we're not clinicians, so this is not a highly clinical talk. But what we do have is nearly 60 years of combined professional experience in law enforcement, Joe and I. And you know, to us, that gives us the credibility to be able to speak accurately about the things that we talk about, because not only have we lived some of this stuff, we've witnessed it, and we continue to serve in a capacity where we're helping people who are currently going through it in our public safety liaison position. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and get it in gear, and we'll get it moving. Thank you, folks. So to get it in gear, the first thing that we'll discuss here amongst the three topics is enhanced risk factors that can impact the mental well-being of first responders during a major crisis. The major crisis we're talking about, that's COVID and the civil unrest. And then there's sort of offshoots of that as well. You know, uncertainty, anticipatory grief, financial crisis, et cetera, which we'll touch on. The second part of it is why resilience matters in crisis times and generally in life, and how it transcends law enforcement and the first responder culture into humanity. And then the third thing we'll discuss is possible outcomes and critical considerations for first responders and behavioral health professionals, whom I know we have plenty on the call today. So we're super stoked about that, to have professionals on here. Many of these things, if not 100% of them, will be very familiar to you as clinicians, even the resilience part. So let's go ahead and get it in gear. So we'd like to first establish a baseline, right? Before we talk about the critical considerations and the impact, let's talk about the life of a first responder. Now, on the left there, we have certainly, I would say, extreme examples of what life can look like for a firefighter, police officer, even EMTs, dispatchers, corrections, right? That's the extreme version. The sympathetic is activated, fight or flight, hypervigilance, massive dumps of adrenaline, and the corresponding stress response of cortisol, right? And then on the right, we have there the parasympathetic activated at home, right? You're sort of in that magic chair, as Dr. Kevin Gilmartin speaks about it in his famous book, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. It's essentially you coming home from work and you're spiraling down big time because of the hypervigilance, right? The frequency with which you are spiking and coming down off of that. And, the reality is that, when a lot of folks come home from work, they're mistaking their exhaustion for physical exhaustion. And really what we know is it's emotional exhaustion from dealing with people's issues all day, from the multiple spikes in adrenaline and the downward spiral from that. And the most likely thing for you to do, the default, is to get in sort of that magic chair, as Dr. Kevin Gilmartin points out. Grab a beer, take a nap. The only thing missing from that is a bag of chips, which, as we know, is probably the worst thing that we could do to spiral out of that and put ourselves back on the upward spiral. Healthy coping skills, right? Healthy self-management. That's what we're going to talk about in the resilience piece. So again, this is to establish a baseline. We're not even talking about COVID. We're not talking about civil unrest. This is the daily operation of a first responder. Here's the reality. It's not just operational stress like you see on the left-hand side. It's not just responding to that terrorist event or that massive fire. There's organizational stress that is a killer, as we know, right? The internal struggle, the struggle to satisfy your administration, to satisfy the demands of the community, and our own demands that we place on ourselves. So there's operational and organizational stress that can both create that picture on the right side of the screen. So we're going to talk about that. Before we get into the operational stress portion, there's a very important component that we want to point out that's very relevant to our conversation. And that is, are substance use and co-occurring mental health issues a real concern for first responders? And if so, how prevalent is it? Well, that's a very poignant topic that we're going to delve into. So if you look at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, depending upon where you look, but if you look here, you'll see anywhere from 800 to 900,000 police officers, active police officers in the United States. Statistics show that 20 to 25% of those individuals have a chemical dependency. They're walking around with an active addiction, okay? That's roughly 200,000 police officers. The stats for firefighters and EMTs aren't as large, but they're pretty similar. I happen to think, as does my colleague Joe Collins, because we live it anecdotally, I don't have the statistics to support it, but I am going to offer this and clarify that statement. I think it's gravely underestimated. I think it's a hugely conservative number, that 200,000. Why? Well, what I can tell you is that alcohol is pretty much the most accepted coping mechanism in the first responder culture. Why? It's legal. It's also one of those socially accepted things that we learn from an early stage in our career, perhaps the academy, that unwinding with alcohol is the most accessible thing to do. In your mind, it's the most effective short-term thing to do. Therefore, it becomes your default mechanism. And I can tell you, I can think of way more people that I've worked with and that I've known that were prone to binge drinking and drinking unnecessarily large quantities, as opposed to those people who didn't drink at all. So, and that scale is not just tipped a little bit. It's more like this, in favor of the people who had, I would say, binge drinking issues or drank unnecessarily large amounts, right? As opposed to the people who weren't into that. So anecdotally, that's what I've known in my career. And I know Joe, because we've talked about this many, many times, Joe feels exactly the same way. So those are conservative statistics in our viewpoint. There's the number for firefighters. It's over 1 million if you do volunteer and career firefighters. And there's the number for EMTs and paramedics. So they're very similar. Here's another study that's worth noting. It's published by the University of Phoenix. 85% of first responders have experienced issues related to their mental health, right? That's cumulative or vicarious trauma. So they've experienced a critical event, traumatic event on the job. 55% of those people say that their supervisor, at least their perception, their supervisor will treat them differently if they mention their mental health. 55%. 69% said mental health services are seldom or never used. So 69%, almost 3/4 of them said, yeah, we know services are available, but we would never use them, right? Here's another statistic that's really just applicable to all across the demographic. It's not really particular or specific to first responders. And that's 1 in 5 families will experience a mental health crisis. 1 in 5 families. I mean, there's several hundred people on this call right now. Do the math. Every 5th person will be touched by this, right? There's only one conclusion that you can come to when you consider these statistics. And if you are in this culture, you understand there's only one conclusion, and that's it. It's the underlying word right there. It's the stigma. It's the stigma that comes with mental health treatment that holds them back. It's the shame. It's the fear. It's, hey, man, is this going to be a career ender for me? Right? I'm probably preaching to the choir as I'm saying this to many of the folks on here, but stigma is alive and well. And I can tell you that we are starting to certainly turn a corner in our culture because of things like resiliency training and because of webinars like this and because of the dedication and commitment that law enforcement and first responder culture, this renewed commitment to officer wellness over the last several years. It certainly has started to turn the corner. We have a lot of work left to do, though. But the stigma is starting to be, I will say, mitigated in a lot of places with peer support programs and officer wellness programs and that so forth. So we are starting to see a cultural shift. Now, this is not going to be a suicide prevention component of the talk, but it's important that we recognize how much of an issue this is in first responder culture. If you look at the statistics from 2017 on this next slide, and you move up to the top to 2020, that number is 144 as of this morning. Now, this is, I believe, the 12th or 13th time Joe and I have done at least a version of this presentation for folks, and we've had to change it every time. I had to change this 2 days ago to make it 144. The number doesn't go down, the number goes up every time. So since April of this year, we've changed that number now 13 times to increase it, 144. It's a real issue. Obviously, we know that. And an officer is way more prone to die by taking their own life than they are in a shooting or something like that in the line of duty death. It's something for us to really, really reflect on and take note of as we move through this. So what are the risks in public safety? Well, let's talk about them. And the fact that, being in public safety, it's inherently a difficult profession that can and will lead to mental health struggles if self-awareness and self-management is not taught at early stages of the career. We're talking in the academy. This has to be part of what we call, and I'll do air quotes, operational vernacular. It needs to be a normal conversation. This can't be something that we talk about sort of in a room off to the side or in secret, or these conversations that are sort of taboo that you only hold this conversation with one other person. It needs to be talked about every day. It needs to be talked about in academies, at in-service training, at roll calls, getting coffee, in the gym. It needs to be part of the normalcy, right? The normal operational vernacular, the vocabulary. So here's some feedback that we've seen, and it represents trauma in first responder culture. So there's a survey that was done that says, depending upon where you're at, where you work. I mean, these numbers could be different depending upon where you're if you're a cop in Chicago or New York, as opposed to a bedroom community or a suburban community. But in essence, these are general statistics. They say that 3 traumas are experienced every 6 months, so roughly 7, right? And again, that could change depending upon where you work. If you do those numbers, right, and we're talking about significant trauma, we're not talking about like, oh, I had a bad day, because having a bad day in law enforcement could mean you witnessed a homicide, or you responded to, an awful accident where several members of a family were killed. The abuse of children, right? These are major T's, big T's as we call them in our profession. We're not talking about little T's. So 7 of those a year. The average career of, let's say, a police officer or a firefighter, easily 2 decades, 20 years. It's 140 critical events easily that they could experience. The repercussions of leaving those things untreated, well, I don't need to explain to this audience what that could do to the psyche and the mindset and the relationships of a first responder. They're significant. So here's additional risk factors according to SAMSHA, right? And we sort of joke about this, but we're mostly serious when we joke about it. These are risk factors that SAMSHA that they put on this report. It almost sounds like a job description for a first responder. I mean, Joe and I have said, this could have been on the job application, and I'll just go through it real quick. Exposure, direct or indirect to death, grief, injury, pain, loss, as a result of exposure to threats or personal safety. Long hours, frequent shifts, longer shift hours, poor sleep, physical hardships, and other negative experiences. This is not only familiar, again, it sounds like a job description for the average first responder. So obviously you can see the risk factors are, perhaps multiplied by 10 or 20 being in this profession. So what are the additional risk factors for first responders during COVID and civil unrest? So we're talking about 2 historical events, right? One of them alone would have been, I would say, a big enough stressor to have major impact, right? If we had COVID on its own, or the civil unrest on its own. But here we are in a position at a time frame where they were literally layered on top of each other, right? So there's almost no rest. There was almost no recovery psychologically and physically from COVID. In fact, it's still going on, right? And then we have the civil unrest, and with that, it's brought an environment. And this is a phrase or an acronym used a lot, especially in the special forces community. We took this from Unbeatable Mind. Mark Devine is a former Navy SEAL commander, so I want to give credit. But they refer to it as VUCA. It's a VUCA environment. VUCA standing for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, right? That is, in essence, operational stress. It's acute operational stress, right? For many reasons. First of all, COVID, the unseen enemy, right? It's tasteless, it's odorless. You can't fight it, you can't touch it, but it's out there and it's killing people, right? It's creating massive fiscal issues. It's creating massive relationship issues, community engagement issues, personal issues for folks, right? Fear of the unknown, or what we would call anticipatory grief, which as clinicians, I know you understand how much uncertainty and instability that can bring to a person's life. Anticipatory grief. You don't know what's around the next corner. And for first responders, they already live in that vortex. There's already a lot of unknown threats around the corner, right? When you respond to a 911 call, when you make a motor vehicle stop, right? You don't know essentially what's on the other side of that. So they're already living in the vortex of fear of the unknown. And it's amplified greatly statistically with COVID. Now, how about repeated exposures to trauma and death? Well, we already know that's part of the job description, right? Well, how about the fact that first responders, police officers, were actually assigned to drive on ambulances? I heard of a story in North Jersey here, where I'm based out of, actually in southern New Jersey, where there were police departments in northern New Jersey that were close to New York. They were begging other counties for body bags because they ran out of them. There was a story that I heard about a police officer who responded to almost 15 deceased persons in one shift. One shift. As we know, your brain's not built for that. There's no amount of training that can prepare you for that type of repetitive exposure to trauma and death. It has an impact, right? And if we don't have those self-management skills, and even before the self-management, the self-awareness, there's generally not good outcomes, right? So that's what this is all about. Now, certainly increased isolation and quarantine. We know there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of science and studies to report the effects of isolation and quarantine. It can cause massive anxiety and depression, which we all know. Public perception and civil liberty. You know, the police profession, unlike, I would say, firefighter and EMTs and of the sort, there is a high level of perception that it's a thankless job, right? So you don't get into it for a lot of gratitude from people or a lot of recognition, right? And now with COVID, right, first responders and specifically law enforcement, there was a lot of occupying force attitude toward law enforcement, right? I'll give you an example. Police officers who are being directed by their state governments to remove moms and kids from playgrounds, they don't have a mask on. Now, I don't know of any police officer who wants to get in the middle of that. They were required to do that. So that's a very uncomfortable thing to do, and it's a very uncomfortable space for police officers. Having been one for 25 years, I can attest to that. Now, also, there's the fear of infecting family and loved ones. It's not just about self. It's about contaminating family members. When this first started, the first 6 to 8, even 10 weeks of this, there were very specific outlined protocols by the CDC in certain states on how you had to decontaminate when you came home from work. I mean, most of the cops that I knew, they had the place set up either outside their home or in their garage, where they literally had to take their uniform off, put it in a bag, in a hazmat bag, and take it to a special cleaning service. Could you imagine doing that every day? Maybe some of you did that yourself. That weighs on your psyche heavily, right? Because, I mean, you're thinking just subconsciously, did I get all the germs off me? Is COVID, on me? I mean, nobody knew the details at this point. So really, really impacting families. And then, of course, paranoia and fear of being a target. This is always on the mind of law enforcement. And now more than ever, when you're having police officers literally assassinated in their cars. We've had many, many attempts at least, I would say attempted murder on police officers, trying to light police vehicles on fire. This is a very real thing, and it manifests itself in the mind of a police officer as situational awareness. Situational awareness can be good. It can keep you alive at work, right? It's a good thing to be situationally aware and recognize threats around you. I mean, that's really embedded in our DNA, is it not? As cavemen and cavewomen, you had to recognize threats, right? To be able to live another day, so to speak. So it's sort of encoded in our DNA. But as a first responder, when you are constantly bombarded with real threats, this multiplies itself astronomically. And it can quickly overstep the boundary. It can step into from situational awareness to paranoia. And we know that that is never a physically or mentally healthy state to be in. So we've talked a lot about the stress coming in toward the first responder, right? And this is a thing that we talk about with the first responder folks and the audiences. And I just talked about this yesterday with a SWAT team. And this is a snapshot, not of first responders. This is the general demographic, our society as a whole. If you look at that top graph there, that bar, 83% of people reporting that the future of our nation is in a significant crisis, and it's a significant source of stress. So the vast majority of people that you're going to deal with as first responders, they're in a hyper-aroused state, right? There is some anxiety, there is some depression. Who knows how they've been affected? Have one of their loved ones been, taken from them as a result of COVID or some other type of violence? These are the folks that you're responding to potentially help. So what we say is to first responders and cops specifically, we need to pump the brakes. We need to develop some more empathy, take a breath, right? Calm yourself, regulate yourself, because the people that you're going to help are just as stressed as you are, if not more, right? So this is a really important thing for first responders to sort of come in, they come out from the 30,000 foot view and they get a little bit more focused. And they understand that everyone's dealing with something right now, right? And perhaps it could give them or cause them to act in a more empathetic way. Here's another graph. Look at that top one there in 2020, 72%, so nearly 3/4 of the people surveyed, they would represent this or describe it as the lowest point in the nation's history they can remember. I mean, it's pretty apparent there are generally negative attitudes about what's going on. And again, what comes to mind is that occupying force as law enforcement can be seen so much, right? So much of the time. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Joe, and Joe's going to discuss why resilience matters in a crisis, just in general, but now more than ever as we're facing COVID and civil unrest. Joe?
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate that. And we really appreciate everybody that's here today. And as Eric explained earlier, it's truly from across the country. And we're really grateful and that you're here. So we're going to talk a little bit about resilience and why resilience matters and what it actually is when we're dealing with situations like this. And what we use as an analogy between the tennis ball and the egg is that if you drop both of them on the floor, obviously you want to be the tennis ball and you want to be able to bounce back. You want to be able to develop those type of skills that when you're going through an adverse or a difficult situation, that you actually come through and you become stronger and you actually adapt or overcome the adversity that you're facing. And that's what we talk about when we're dealing with adversity and resiliency. But we don't want anybody to believe that because you have some resiliency skills, that you're going to be impervious to trauma, that you're not going to face adverse situations or difficult situations. We all do every day. We're going to be, whether it's a small situation or a large situation. I heard the analogy yesterday that, the curve in the road doesn't have to be the end of the journey unless you can't navigate the corner. And then it actually is the end of the road. And what we try to do is give you the tools to be able to navigate through resiliency and different adverse situations. So what it's really all about, it's about self-awareness and self-regulation and self-management. It's explaining what the tools are, actually doing a deep dive to yourself to develop and identify what are your values, and are you living your values when you're involved in these situations, and catch yourself. If you start spiraling down or you're doing things that don't meet your values and what you want to be recognized as a human being, not just every day, but during crisis, and who are you? So we use a phrase called catching yourself. And that's basically identifying the fact that, you know what, this isn't who I want to be. I don't want to be this person. I don't want to be identified as this. And you plug some of these different resiliency things into those. And it's developing a sense of gratitude. And what does that mean? Well, what it is that actually recognizing the fact that positive things are going around us every single day of our lives. Because unfortunately, in the human psyche, it's over 80% of us actually default to negativity on different situations. And I think it's probably a larger percentage in the first responder community, because what we've been trained to do in our lives and in all of the different calls is kind of break them down, debrief as we come back and we're going through and identify the things that went wrong so that we don't repeat them. And unfortunately, what that does is it creates neural pathways in our brains to recognize and identify negative situations or bad things. And that's our default then. So it actually takes a lot of work actually to recognize the thing that there are positive things that are going on around us every single day and things that we actually consider a blessing, because you need to actually develop optimism and you need to actually practice optimism to be a positive person. Otherwise, you're going to be that person that's negative. And we all know who those people are in our lives. I say that there are no people that are neutral. There's either negative or positive people. They're giving you energy or they're sucking it out of you. And we don't want to be around the people that are drawing energy out of us. We want to be around the people that are positive and giving us energy. And who are we? What we want to do is we want to do a self-reflection. So another thing that we talk a lot about is learning from adverse experiencing. And what it really draws down to is that when bad things are happening, when adverse situations are going on, what is it trying to teach me? Why is it that I'm here, and what am I supposed to learn from this situation, rather than why is this happening to me and pointing fingers at other people? There's a great phrase by Viktor Frankl. We refer to him a lot during our meaning making portion of this. And he says that in between stimulus and response, there is a pause, there's a gap. And within that gap, we choose our response. And within that response, we can define our humanity and choose our freedom. And that's really what it boils down to, is that we want people to be able to respond to situations. And when you respond to a situation, you're actually using your prefrontal cortex. You're thinking your way through the situation, responding appropriately rather than reacting. And when we react, that's based on more of the mammalian or the reptile brain, that we're just quickly going off an emotional response and a reaction. And bad things happen when we react rather than we respond. So if you want to move to the next slide, Bill, this slide here has a whole lot going on, but what it really does is it defines the entire resiliency program that we try to teach, that came from the University of Pennsylvania through the military. And then it came to the FBI National Academy. We were invited to the Air Force to do that, and they gave us the whole program. So the whole program, again, started with Martin Seligman out of the University of Pennsylvania, and he put together the positive psychology model. So if we take a look at this, and some military talk about the event being the bang or the boom, but we're going to go left of the event, left of the boom in this particular situation. So it's before something happens. And you either have resiliency training or you don't have resiliency training. So the lines are not straight on purpose. There's ups and downs as we go through life. There's ups and downs as we're leading up to what we may consider an event or a boom in our life. But what's interesting is that if you take a look at the line leading up through resiliency training, when you're getting resiliency training, there's bigger ups and downs. So what we try to do when we're developing resiliency and giving people skills is to push on the comfort zones. So that's why you see that there's bigger hills, bigger valleys, because we want to challenge your belief systems. We want to challenge your values to make sure that they're locked in place, so that when you have your 9/11 moment or your October 1, or you have your different situations, that you have some skills in place. We like to refer to it as the resiliency toolbox or the bat belt, so that you can pull something out and plug it in place during that event. So our goal then is, once we get to the center there, when the event happens, we want to try to stay above the event. It's going to be adverse, it's going to be difficult, but what we don't want people to do is drop below the event and have it become a traumatic situation. Because if we move then to the next set there, where you see the green line, if you're learning from it, if you're asking the questions of yourself, what is this event trying to teach me? Do I have the resources to be able to plug and play and actually become stronger as a result of what I'm going through? We become stronger, and we call that post-adversity growth. And if we do that, you can see in the green box, there's a lot of positive things that can happen if we do that. We can gain better self-confidence, we can enhance our leadership skills, and we can develop stronger personal strength, we can develop a better spiritual growth, and we can have an appreciation for life. And that's really what we want as we're traveling through our careers, through our lives, who we interact with. We want positive things to happen. Now, if we're going and we hit the event or the boom, and it becomes a traumatic situation because we don't necessarily have the resources, then you're going to see that red line. And that's where we hope people don't get onto. But we know there are a lot of people in our career field and in our lives that we interact with that are not strong, and they don't have resiliency skills. So they start slipping and they start sliding down that red line. And unless there's some type of a self-limited interaction where you all of a sudden have some type of epiphany and you say, wait a minute, I got to shake myself out of this and I got to get back where I want to be. Or you have somebody else step in. Maybe it's a peer support person. Maybe it's another person that you're working with that says, hey, listen, Joe, this ain't you. What's going on? And it's kind of, they pull you out of that spiral. Or unfortunately, they keep sliding and they get down to the point where you see treatment is necessary. And as the slide said before, that Bill showed, 144 people slipped past that and they didn't get help. They didn't get anything, and they kept spiraling down to the point where 144 that we know about right now, as of today, have taken their lives within the public safety realm. So if they start sliding down on that and they keep spiraling, they keep ruminating on the negative, then all of those things in the red box can occur. You can become more anxious about the situation, more angry. Substance abuse can come into play, violence toward the people that you care about or yourself. And then it just leads to a whole lot of other things and isolation because you believe nobody can understand what you're going through, and there's no real hope at the end of that that spiral. So if you want to move to the next slide, Bill, we'll get into a little bit more definition about what we mean about spiraling down versus spiraling up. And it really is all based on the broaden and build theory. And if you want more of that, you can Google it. You can go deep into any one of the different things that we talk about. But what we mean about spiraling down is that when somebody's going to a dark place, when they're encountering difficult situations, when they don't really understand that there's a way out, and Bill talked about it, you know, the adrenaline and cortisol is very important when we need to fight, when we need to be able to grapple, when we need to be able to protect ourselves or somebody else. But what those drugs are is they're very corrosive. If we keep it in our system and we keep dumping those things into our system, it's almost like if you're into race car driving, the nitrous oxide in a race car is that at some point you're going to push that button and all of these chemicals are going to get dumped into the engine and you're going to go really, really fast. The problem is if you hold that button down, you're going to blow up the motor. And it's almost like a pressure cooker. If a pressure cooker doesn't have a release valve, a pressure cooker is not a pressure cooker, it's a bomb. And what we need to be able to do is give people pressure release valves, give them the ability to manage and regulate their release valves. And if they're spiraling down, what happens is that they become more narrow of the situation, and then more stress is introduced, and then they have a negative emotional response to it, and then they have more of a threat condition, and it just keeps spiraling down, and it will keep going until it hits the bottom, whatever that bottom is. Now, the opposite is spiraling up, obviously. So let's say that you do have a stress response, or you have something that actually created the event that took place, and all of a sudden you're like stepping back from it and saying, hey, listen, something's going on here, but I have some skills that I can plug into play. So right away, you're going to have a positive response to that situation, which actually gives you a broader perspective and a broader view then of the situation, which actually opens up your spiral. It opens up your perspective of what you can implement, put in place, and then it becomes stronger and stronger. Now, when we talked about that slide before on that spiral, when we actually can potentially pull somebody out of there and get them actually on a positive note, what we kind of refer to is there's multiple different levels of this. Catch yourself, catching yourself. That means if you're spiraling down, catching yourself is stopping the spiral. And then catching yourself is actually jumping over to the upward spiral then. And we call that the 100 level is stopping your spiral. The 200 level is jumping over to the upward spiral. If you're going to implement a 300 level, now you're going to start spiraling up. That means that you're plugging in those different resources you have, the different tools that you put in place, and now you're spiraling up. And what we want to do then is move on to the graduate level course. And what the graduate level course is in the whole spectrum here is bringing somebody with you. Is that if you can recognize the fact that you're in a traumatic situation, you can stop yourself from spiraling, you change it to an adverse situation, and then you recognize other people are around you that need your help, then you jump across and you bring them along for the ride so that everybody becomes stronger as a result of the actions of the collective. So we can move to the next slide. And this is the whole foundation of what we do when we teach our resiliency training program. It's built on science out of the University of Pennsylvania. We talked about four domains. The domains are mental, physical, social, and spiritual. And the tenets are what hold up the domains. So you have to get in, you have to dig into all of these different things, build up each one of these tenets, each one of those domains, so that you have the skill set, the resources, and the wherewithal to become a better person. And that's really what we're trying to do through resiliency, through self-regulation, through self-awareness and self-management of who you are and who you want to be. So the next slide then, these are some of the protective factors and the techniques that we teach during some of these different things that we do. So self-care, obviously, we talk about a lot of the different things, how important sleep and exercise is. You know, that I caught myself when I realized that I was working out of my office and I'm an outside person. I really didn't want to be stuck inside. I needed to be away. And I was actually on a call with Bill doing something. And I was like, you know, Bill, I got to get out. I got to do something. And I recently became a Texan. I moved down here in August to get away from Wisconsin's weather that they're suffering from right now. And so you know what, I got to get out. I got to do something. So I moved a whole lot of boxes. I became physical. And what that did is it dumped the correct chemicals into my body to alleviate the fact that I was spiraling down mentally. So I caught myself catching myself. I figured out, you know what, I got these different resources. Hey, here's one. And I plugged it in and I felt much better afterward. Some of the other things we do is we really dig into the whole mindfulness exercises, what you can do. One of our instructors talks about a really neat phrase, and it's called be where your feet are. And you can't be where your feet are if you're thinking about what happened yesterday or what's going to happen tomorrow. You have to be in the present. And there's a reason they call it the present. It's because it can be a gift if you're really present and you're understanding what's going on around you. We delve into meditation and how important it is to take control of your thoughts. Because if you're not in control of your thoughts, they're in control of you. And just simply taking time to be able to clear your mechanism and do that, different things like that. Breathing exercises, we talk a lot about that and how breathing is really the one way that you can take control of your parasympathetic nervous system instantly. It's the only way that you can truly do that and get the correct chemicals in your body. In law enforcement and first responders, David Grossman talked about tactical breathing. And what it is basically box breathing. So you breathe into your nose to the count of 4, hold to the count of 4, push it out through your mouth to the count of 4, hold to the count of 4, and you do that 4 different times to be able to activate the positive chemicals to get in, deactivate some of those cortisols. When Bill was talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, we refer to the sympathetic nervous system as the gas pedal in the human body, and the parasympathetic nervous system is the brake pedal. And it's really giving people the skill set and the awareness that you are in control of your vehicle. And you just need to know when and how to be able to activate the different systems. Drawing boundaries. You know, when I grew up, the news was at 5, 6, and 10, and then the TV went off at midnight. And unfortunately, right now, that the news cycle can be very corrosive, and it can be what we call as an activating event. Is if you get stuck in front of the news and watching all of the news that's going on around the country, that can be very detrimental. Is that you can start spiraling. And I know a whole lot of friends that are constantly posting and sending me messages about what's going on. And I try to avoid as much as I can. Obviously, I want to stay current with some of the things that are going on, but I'm aware that that could potentially be an activating event for me. So I take control of that. And take one day at a time. Like I talked about, being meaning making and being present in where you are and understanding the fact that you can control certain things and there's other things that you can't control. Bill used the example of this pandemic right now. So we can't control as far as what the time is. We don't know that if this is the beginning, middle, or the end of this whole thing. And we're not in control of being able to resolve it. The only thing we can control is our response and who we respond as and how we're going to be viewed coming through this. And develop a routine. You know, a lot of people talk about you have to do something for at least 3 weeks to make it a practice. We talk about gratitude, doing that as a 21-day gratitude challenge and other things to get put in place so that you actually start developing the skill set that you know you need to do, but you have to force yourself. Resiliency is a muscle. It has to be exercised to be able to be developed. And when you develop a muscle, you actually have to break it down. You have to tear it a little bit to be able to make it stronger. And keeping a clean and uncluttered living environment. You know, the reflection of where you work in can have a significant impact on your mental state. And it's just taking care of your business and taking care of who you are. So, Bill, you can move on. And I think that this is one that you're going to jump in on, I think, correct? You have to unmute yourself, though.
Yep, gotcha. Thanks, Joe. And so, you know, before I move on to the continuation here, I mean, look, none of these things singularly are, I would say, you know, a game changer or transformational, but together, and if you use these as sort of a holistic plan that you practice every day, not that you could do everything every day, but if you could check off many of these, it will restore control, really, because as humans, we like to have predictability. That's what this is about. not to be a control freak, as someone would refer to it, or to be, obsessive compulsive about it. But having control gives you some mindfulness. It gives you some security. It gives you the ability to predict to a degree what your day is going to look like. So if you can mitigate some of the things, some of the stress in your life by doing some of these things and creating habits, well, then when a crisis comes, you're better equipped, you're better positioned to deal with the crisis instead of worrying about all those other little things, right? Makes perfect sense. So continue to hear the techniques, seeking out positivity in relationships and activities, motivational videos. I mean, look, Joe said it earlier. There's energy givers, there's energy suckers. We all know them. And when you have to put too much work into a relationship, perhaps it's time for you to reevaluate and reassess that relationship, right? Whether you need that relationship or maybe you should limit the interaction with that person or thing, right? As an energy sucker. And certainly motivational videos. I mean, who doesn't feel good when they see something they identify with, whether it's a sports figure, a political figure, or some sort of historical figure that has done something great in their life? I mean, it goes without saying, those things can be very inspirational. And when you do it on a regular basis, it starts to implant, right? New neural pathways, as we call them, right? New positivity, those track marks in the mud, the good track marks, to have some impact positively on you, right? So physical distancing versus social distancing. I mean, look, we're doing it right now. Joe and I joke about this all the time. If we had said, hey, if you would have called one of your colleagues or somebody that you weren't really familiar with, and you said, hey, let's connect on a Zoom call, chances are you probably would say, this person's creepy. Why do they want to see me on a call? I mean, why would they want to FaceTime me? I mean, it's just the truth. We laugh about that, but now it's part of our normal operations. Now doing a video conference with someone is as simple as, logging on or FaceTime. So it is part of the normal procedure that we do. So physical distancing, perhaps we still have to do that as per the CDC and what we're experiencing. But social distancing does not have to be a component. It does not have to add to our stress. We can do it through video conferencing. Learning a new skill. I mean, this is a great way to activate that part of your brain that perhaps has been dormant a little bit, right? And there is a ton of things on YouTube that are free. There's a great service, and we don't get anything for mentioning this. Just as a clarifying statement, Masterclass. It's a consortium of subject matter experts on anything you could imagine. It does call, I'm not sure what the cost is, but it's like a monthly fee, or I think you might even be able to do a one-time thing where you see a subject matter expert talk about guitar playing or finances or whatever it is. Really, really interesting stuff. I've seen it before. And then certainly there's Audible. Now with, phones and Bluetooth headsets, it's so easy, or a car ride to work or wherever you're going. It's so easy to put a book on audio or a podcast and really, really learn some new stuff. I mean, I know I've taken advantage of this during COVID. I was doing it before, but I amped it up tenfold during COVID. When I'm exercising, when I'm riding my bike, I like to plug into a podcast or throw on a book, which we'll talk about some great resources at the end of this. Engaging in passion outside of work. This one, I can tell you personally, was very impactful for me. Now, I will qualify that statement by saying I didn't quite honestly know at the time how important this was to my overall well-being, mentally and physically, during my career. In other words, I had interests and folks and people and relationships that meant a lot to me that were completely outside of the realm of law enforcement when I was in law enforcement. I didn't do it purposefully to say, well, I'm not going to socialize with cops all the time. I'm going to do it with these people because I think it's mentally healthy. I didn't say that. I wish I had a better story for you. But I can tell you unequivocally, it was a major component in allowing me not just to survive my career, but to thrive in my career. Here's why. Hear me out. It's very important, and we stress this all the time, to gain different perspectives, right? If you're all cop all the time or all firefighter all the time, you gain, and it's very likely that you will gain this perspective that nobody understands you, that it's us versus them. And obviously, that's not a healthy paradigm to live in, right? It's not a healthy thing to subscribe to psychologically. So when you start to see versions that are opposing your view of things, when you're starting to open your mind. It's the growth mindset, right? It's a big part of resilience, growth mindset. When you engage in things outside of law enforcement, you gain different perspective. And that is personal and professional growth. So engaging in passions outside of work is huge, huge. And that could be, a group that has nothing to do with law enforcement, just hanging around with them socially, or doing things like playing in a band or gaining an appreciation of art, things like that activate the different part of your brain, right? So being mindful, intentional about work-life balance, this is a big one, especially as the majority of the workforce is now working from home. And, I, as Joe, we worked from home even before this happened. So we had a good understanding of it, a good balance of it. But if you did not before the pandemic and what's going on now, and now all of a sudden you're working from home and everybody else and your kids are homeschooled, it can become a burden, right? When everybody's working from home and you tend to find yourself on the computer after hours, late at night, trying to get one more email in. Now, we're not saying that you shouldn't be productive and you shouldn't take advantage of alone time to be, efficient at work. That's not the message. The message is you need to draw a boundary. You need to shut it off. Nobody should be expected to work 18 hours a day, right? And even intervals of hard work or busy work, broken up by some sort of physical activity, physical moving, whether it's a 10-minute walk, whether it's just doing some stretching, jumping jacks, whatever it is to get that heart rate up and recover from it. That's what we're talking about in work-life balance. And you don't need a gym or anything else to do that, right? You could do it in your living room. So ABC or SILS, SILS is kind of a commonly refused acronym or commonly referred to acronym in the special forces community and military. It essentially means stop, look, listen, and smell before you have an emotional reaction, right? Science says that it takes about 90 seconds or so for your limbic system to recognize an emotion, feel that emotion, and have it pass, right? So that's where we talk about the ABC. The ABC is the activating event, right? The brain's interpretation, and then C, the consequence, the ABC. So what we teach in the resiliency curriculum is to pause. Pause for 60 to 90 seconds. Say to yourself, ABC, recognize the emotion that you're feeling, take a deep breath, gain some awareness on how you're about to respond, and then have your response. It's just like typing the angry email, right? We know that never has a good outcome. It might feel good at the moment. And, our chief medical officer, Dr. Michael Genovese, says something that's pretty funny, and it's true. He says, when you're activated, when there's some sort of confrontation, whether it's face-to-face or in an email, the first thing that you want to say or type, even though it make you feel good, it's probably not the right thing to say or type. And man, I really took that to heart. That is something that we talk about all the time. You may have some self-gratification. I'm getting the last word in, or I'll show them, right? That can give some immediate self-gratification, but in the long term, it's probably not the appropriate thing to say and may cause more damage than good. And then, of course, journaling. Journaling does not have to be an everyday practice. Journaling could be a periodic thing that you do 2 or 3 days a week or once a week on the weekends. What it does for us, and the way we explain this to first responders, is even when there's an event that causes you some activation that gets the hair on the neck standing up, so to speak, it pisses you off, to use a common term. It's good to journal about that, because you can go back and look at it a week or 2 weeks from now and say, why did I feel that way? Why was I angry? And does this matter right now as much as it mattered then? Usually the answer is, it's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. It was your emotional response to that event. So we're transitioning to the closing of this, and we're going to bring it in for a landing. So where do we go from here as a profession and as clinicians, behavioral health clinicians? Well, again, we talked about all the things, the critical considerations for those on the front lines. And many of these things are actually finding an indirect way back to the clinician, right? Because in essence, well, you're the folks who are going to be dealing with the first responders, right? You're going to be the people who are going to facilitate treatment and healing for these folks. How is it going to impact you? Well, here's what we know is going to happen, without a doubt. We've already seen it. We see it every day. And like I said, Joe and I work nationally, so it gives us credibility. When I say this, I don't mean this figuratively, I mean this literally. We have worked with everyone from Alaska State Troopers to Miami up to Maine, back down to Texas, and everything in between. Literally, that's not a figurative statement. And what we can tell you is unequivocally, and we can say with a high level of accuracy through experience, is that you could take the person's name, the geography, and the department out of the fact pattern, and the fact pattern remains the same. Why? Well, because of the continuity of the experience of the first responder. They're all going through the same stuff, right? And part of that is this dichotomy of stressors that first responders, and we'll talk about police officers specifically right now, those first three things you see in this slide: emotional detachment, distrust, and cynicism. Hear me out on these things, these three things. Ironically, these are three imperative skills that you need as a cop that actually makes you good at what you do. It actually keeps you alive at work to practice these three things. Unfortunately, they don't transcend very well into personal life. Here's why. Emotional detachment, okay? First up, if you were not able to emotionally detach yourself from the trauma and the critical events that you experience, perhaps daily on the job, you wouldn't make it through a singular shift, let alone a couple decades of a career, right? So emotional detachment is something that is imperative. You're taught from day one, don't show your emotions. Why? Well, because it looks weak. You look unstable. You have to be stoic, right? You're there. You're the badge. You're the authority. You have to go. You have to take command of these situations, okay? So, and you have to do it in sort of a non-emotional, outward way, right? The perception has to be that you're in control. So there's emotional detachment. Next is distrust, right? There's a saying in law enforcement: if the person's lips are moving, they're lying. What does that mean? Well, here's the truth of the matter. I'm going to be very direct about this, and I hope I don't offend anybody. Cops have extremely sensitive bullshit meters, okay? They are taught to see through the BS. In fact, assume everyone is lying. That way you'll get to the bottom of things. That's what we're taught from day one. Again, it doesn't translate well to the personal life. Let's take cynicism, right? Cynicism can be disguised as dark humor. Cops don't do this because they have, they have less humanity, because they don't care about people. It's a coping mechanism. I think you all understand that as professionals. Dark humor is really something that you do as opposed to, well, crying or becoming upset. So it's not an insensitivity that's intended toward victims, but it is a consequence of the job, right? So you can see as you're in these things every day, right? You're caught in, as Joe said, the downward spiral. We also call it the TV, and it doesn't mean television. It's trauma vortex. You're caught in this vortex. When you do these things and you practice these things 8, 10, 12 hours a day during your shift, 5, 6 days a week, do you think it becomes your default mechanism? Is it hard to spiral out of it? The answer is yes, absolutely. And that's where resilience comes back in, right? So when you're doing these three things and you experience COVID, the civil unrest, the financial uncertainty, all of these things, do you think anxiety and depression and perhaps post-traumatic stress as an injury will be enhanced? Yeah, you can bank on it. Absolutely, it will be. What does that mean for behavioral health professionals? Well, it's our opinion that not only will you become, but we also have seen this already occurring. You will become the frontline first responders. No pressure on you, clinicians on the call. That's, of course, a joke, because there is a huge responsibility that you have to burden in this. And that's a good thing, because you are professionals and you are prepared, you're educated, you are experienced and trained to be able to deal with these things. Because the clients that you're going to see or that you're already seeing, they will have experienced inordinate amounts of trauma that are exacerbated by these things that we're talking about, COVID. It's not just the baseline anymore. It's these two historical events. So they are going to be regurgitating these things, and you are going to be expected to help them process these things. Now, what are the risk factors for you? There it is, the first line, the first bullet: exposure to trauma not typically seen by your clients, right? And it may take, a good portion of trust building, the first few sessions to really start to delve into what COVID and civil unrest has added or exacerbated by the normal baseline that we talked about. Are you going to face potentially compassion fatigue and burnout? Yeah, you can count on that. Absolutely. Right. And that's why self-care and self-awareness and self-management is equally, if not even more important for you all as you will be treating these frontline heroes. Now, we'd like to end with some good news. We hate to be Debbie Downers during this whole thing, but we realize that, a big part of this is gaining awareness around the negativity that exists around this profession and treating these heroes. Here's the good news, and we can say this with a high level of accuracy. Teletherapy will play a more pronounced role with law enforcement and first responder clients. It already is, right? Some of those requirements have been relaxed in terms of, treaters being able to practice in multiple states or neighboring states. So that's an incredible thing. We hope those relaxed requirements become sort of the norm for you all, because it's just too important for it not to be. And we are advocates, and we endorse that, of course, for all of you. Teletherapy will open up opportunities for this first responder community that they definitely did not have pre-COVID. This was just not part of the normal routine of, being connected with a clinician or a doc, right? It was always, you had to find the person, you had to make sure that they fit. Did they take your insurance? Where are they? Is someone going to see me there? Right? All of these collateral or peripheral things that come into play when you're talking about being connected to somebody and asking for help. So teletherapy has virtually, pun intended, has virtually eliminated a lot of those concerns, being able to do it, through video conference. The truth is, and this is not a pie in the sky, sort of one of those abstract, blanket statements. Well, if you could just save one person, well, I've come to find out, and I know that Joe feels the same way, that is a true statement. You can impact one person, but in reality, it's never one person, because that person has people that care about them, friends, relationships, family members. So when you say if you're just impacting one life, you're doing your job, I can virtually guarantee you, there's that term, virtually again, I can absolutely guarantee you that you are impacting more than one life. And perhaps you're saving a career. So you're impacting multiple lives and organizations by helping these people work through this trauma, process it, and get to a state where they're healing, where they're functional, where they're well, where they're present for themselves, their family, and their organizations. And then, of course, by that, you're influencing outcomes for those in crisis in a big way, right? Families, careers, and lives.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bill. That was awesome. And here are some things that we developed for organizations to ask themselves some questions on how do I get started? So what we did in my last organization, we had developed a wellness team, and we actually went through each one of these questions for the wellness team to figure out whether yes to each one of the questions. If we had a no, then we assigned that question to get an answer for our next meeting. So the first one right out of the gate is, do you have an EAP? Do you have an employee assistance program? What does it look like? What are the services available? How do you access it? And what we did is we had someone from the EAP actually come in and present to all of our supervisors so that they would know when they were directing someone or talking about the EAP, what it would look like. Someone had a question in there about peer support. That I don't have the specific data. If you want to go onto the Department of Justice COPS office, which is a community-oriented police services, they've got a few white papers that they've done emphasizing the significant importance of peer support within organizations and how that can help. But do you have it? Can you have it within your own organization? Or maybe if you're not large enough, do you develop then a regional peer support team? And that's what we're looking to do in Wisconsin, is that we were going to do regional peer support. Or have external confidential sources to go to for assistance. Who do you call? Who can your officers or your staff call if there are issues going on, and making those resources and those telephone numbers available? Are your supervisors trained to recognizing the signs of chronic and adverse reactions to an event? I have a good friend that actually was the police chief during the spa shooting down in the Milwaukee area. And he was meeting with all of his command staff, and he was explaining to this command staff what to look for as signs of potential trauma or stress within their organization with their officers. And he actually paused and started looking around the table, and he recognized that he was seeing all of the signs that he was telling them to look for in their officers. So it's actually recognizing the fact that things are going wrong in yourself and being self-aware. And we talked about that with resilience. What does your insurance benefit cover? Do you know? If you don't know, those are important things to find out pre-event so that you can actually have some type of a ballpark as to what it's going to cost if somebody has to go to residential treatment or to see a therapist, and what those things are going to cost. Is your organization self-insured? If you're self-insured, you have a significantly more leverage to get resources and get things paid for than if you're not. Because if you're self-insured, what you're doing is you're hiring an insurance company to be a money manager. So that money is all yours, and you can potentially, and we've helped a lot of organizations navigate that storm as dealing with the insurance companies. And we talked a little bit about this. What are out-of-pocket costs if you're going to seek treatment? And do you have resources available for physical and mental health of your members? We talked about resiliency. There are a lot of organizations that will help support, a lot of different places that are giving first responder discounts to help with those. And there may be actually organizations within your areas that are providing free therapy for your first responders, and finding that. And I know that there are pockets throughout this country that are doing that right now. And do you have a mechanism in place for spousal support? We've done some presentations directed solely at the spouses, and the spouses are a great and a window into what's really going on in our first responders' lives. So if you can have a mechanism for them to be able to communicate when they see things that are going on, that's going to make your organization stronger and get help maybe sooner than it would if you don't. And then are you aware what the regulations are and the guidelines for first responders and mental health treatment within your state, and whether or not maybe peer support discussions are protected, and whether or not trauma now is part of a workman's comp situation? I know that that's a trend that's spreading across the country as well. So those are all things that you should be aware of. And do you have best practice models that consist with critical incidents? When things happen, there should be situations that trigger responses within your organization on how to help your people when they're facing some of those things. Do you have vetted mental health professionals in your area? And what we refer to those, and we appreciate all those that are here trying to learn more, is that we try to find culturally competent therapists that understand the first responder and public safety world, so that they can go to someone that is going to help them rather than potentially do more harm. Disseminating information. Bill talks about this as well. We have a whole list of articles that talk about resiliency and different things that you can help. And what that does is actually creates the conversation and builds the ability to take down some of those walls that stigma creates within your organization. And it's just simply having a conversation. And I love the way Bill says that, you know what, he sent out a few articles to his organization when he was still there and said, you know what, I read this article and it really struck me as to how somebody was using these skills, and just leave it at that. And it just kind of piques the interest of somebody. It's like, what's he talking about? They may actually read the article and put some of those things in place. Chaplaincy programs, we found that those are very effective as well. And then are you making the information available to the recruits in the academy? We were fortunate to be able to do that in Wisconsin, where we added 40 hours of wellness into the academy when we rolled the new academy out. So you want to explain to some of the books, Bill, and resources that we have there?
Sure would. And we can make these lists available to anybody on the joining us today on the webinar. So we're going to close it out now. We have some fantastic resources that are both good for clinicians and for families of first responders. The first one that we refer to, and I mentioned Kevin Gilmartin's name, this is sort of like the Bible for folks in this space, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. If you haven't read it, I would advise you to get it today. It is, and I don't get anything for saying that. I just think Kevin Gilmartin is an incredibly informed and passionate person. He wrote this probably, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. I've read it 6 or 7 times, and it is fantastic. It really gives you a look behind the curtain, some insight, some introspection on, I would say, the career path of a first responder, specifically a cop, from academy to retirement, and sort of all of those. It's not a linear thing emotionally or physically. It goes like this, as we mentioned earlier in the resilience slide, but wonderful. Talks about hypervigilance, talks about, he calls it the I used to syndrome, which is I used to do this, I used to do that, I used to have interest, I used to be in shape. When a person reflects back on their career, and you can see sort of that downward spiral. So highly, highly recommend. Kevin is a former cop and now a PhD. He was a Tucson, Arizona cop. Excellent read. The second one is also an awesome read and very specific to the clinicians on here. We happen to know Ellen and Joel. They're actually married on there. Psychologist Joel was actually a former cop, LAPD, and then San Rafael in California. Awesome guy. They are two of the people who are very involved with West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat, which is a first responder and military trauma program. Excellent. Joel is fantastic. They've written several books. Highly recommend that. Resilient Minds on the Front Lines. That is a resource that came out of New Jersey that Joe and I were an integral part of. It's sort of a humble brag for us because we're very proud of it. And a colleague of ours who is a former New Jersey police officer, a guy by the name of Michael Pellegrino, who started this. It is a website. You can check it out. It's a bunch of videos that reinforce the resilience mindset. It's based on the resilience curriculum. And we're proud to say that we were part of an initiative that made this training mandatory in New Jersey starting in 2020. So we are the first state in the country to implement a mandatory resilience program. All 36,000 plus police officers in New Jersey will become familiarized with this curriculum. And we believe it's the start of a major cultural shift in terms of officer mental health and wellness. So we're super proud of that. Resilient Minds has been a big part of that. Joe?
Absolutely. So, and then there's some other ones. Addiction and Recovery for First Responders. Drew is a therapist out in the Portland, Oregon area. He worked for Acadia for a while as well as a therapist. And Joel's wife, Ellen, has written a couple of books, I Love a Firefighter and I Love a Police Officer. So it's just what families need to know about how to deal with their significant others. It can be parents as well, and how to do that. Anybody that's a therapist probably recognizes that one book, The Body Keeps Score. Fantastic book about trauma and how our body actually retains trauma and how it could potentially impact us on a day-to-day basis. And one of my favorite books, Bill talked a little bit about how many times he's read the Kevin Gilmartin book, The Why Cafe. It's a very, very easy read. We actually had somebody read it twice overnight between sessions of our resiliency training program. And it simply forces you to find your PFE, which is your purpose for existing. It's also on Audible. Most of these books are on Audible, and Bill said the same thing. It's don't tell me about the books that you've read, tell me about the books you've reread. And I think I'm on my 8th. You listen to it in the car when I have other people as trapped in my vehicle with me.
So then the last thing here is just a report for all of you to take a look at, the First Responder Report by SAMSHA, and then of course, Resilient Minds on the Front Lines. You can go to that link. We will provide any of the resources in here if you'd like afterwards through Starlite. So that essentially brings us in for a landing here. We're super, super honored to be able to speak to a professional audience who gets it. We hope that you've taken a few nuggets out of here, maybe more than a few that you could use that perhaps have caused you to, reflect, self-reflect, and think about how these things can apply in your professional practices or your organizations. Those are our emails, william.mazur@acadiahealthcare.com, and of course, Joe Collins at acadiahealthcare.com. You can contact us directly through Starlite or however it makes sense to you, and we can provide you with a ton of free information. So with that, I will turn it over to Darcel and Eric, and we really appreciate you having us today. Thank you.